The tension in Washington had been simmering for months. Rumors swirled about unaccounted government funds, secretive bureaucracies, and a quiet panic among D.C. insiders. It was the kind of scandal that had the potential to rock the very foundation of the federal government. But few expected the lightning strike to come from Louisiana's sharp-tongued Senator John Neely Kennedy. It was a bright spring morning when Kennedy strode into the Senate chamber, gripping a thick leather dossier that had Capitol Hill buzzing. Word had leaked that he would use his time in a highly anticipated Senate oversight hearing to drop what insiders were calling the $4.7 trillion bombshell. President Donald Trump, now well into his second term, had been demanding more transparency in government finances. He tasked his administration with cutting waste and draining what remained of the bureaucratic swamp. Yet even he hadn't been fully briefed on what Kennedy had uncovered, something the Louisiana senator insisted had been buried deep within obscure agency reports and financial maneuvering stretching back decades. But Kennedy was ready. And he had a target. Senator Elizabeth Warren, the Massachusetts senator, now chair of the Senate Committee on Finance Reform, had built her brand on government accountability, consumer protection, and bold economic oversight. But in recent years, critics argued Warren had shifted from watchdog to gatekeeper, protecting bureaucratic programs rather than holding them accountable. As the cameras rolled and C-SPAN lit up across the country, Kennedy cleared his throat. "Madam Chair," he began, addressing Warren directly, "I respect the Senate. I respect oversight. But what I cannot respect, and what the American people won't stand for, is $4.7 trillion, trillion with a T, just vanishing into the bureaucratic black hole you've been sitting on." A stunned silence gripped the room. Warren adjusted her glasses, trying to maintain composure. "Senator Kennedy, I strongly advise against making unverified claims in a public forum. If you have evidence..." "Oh, I've got evidence," Kennedy snapped, flipping open the dossier. Page after page of financial inconsistencies, vague audits, and ghost departments receiving allocations with no public reporting. "You've either been asleep at the wheel, or you've been helping steer this thing straight into a cliff." The gallery behind the senators erupted in murmurs. Media phones lit up. This wasn't politics as usual. This was war. Kennedy continued, "You've spoken for years about fighting corruption, yet under your watch, entire divisions of the federal bureaucracy are bleeding taxpayers dry, and no one can say where the money's going. If this were a private company, someone would already be in jail." Warren tried to interject. "Senator Kennedy, I demand you yield the floor." "Not until I finish," he fired back. "Because the American people deserve to know. While families struggle to afford gas, groceries, and rent, their government can't account for nearly $5 trillion. That's money that could have rebuilt our schools, secured our border, or cared for our veterans. Instead, it's been spent or stolen without a single receipt." The hearing quickly spiraled into chaos. Senators from both sides called for order, some demanding recess, others insisting the documents be entered into the official record. But Kennedy stood his ground, unflinching, refusing to be silenced. Warren's face had turned pale. She whispered urgently to her staff. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of her unease. What had begun as a routine committee hearing had transformed into a political firestorm, and Senator John Kennedy had just lit the match. As the gavel slammed, marking the session's temporary suspension, the country waited with bated breath. News outlets scrambled for footage. Social media exploded with hashtags like #MissingTrillions and #Kennedy versus Warren, and somewhere inside the West Wing, President Trump leaned back in his chair, watching the feed live with a sly grin. "About damn time someone called them out," he muttered. Back in the Senate chamber, a cold silence hung over the room after the committee adjourned for an emergency recess. But outside, Washington was already on fire. CNN, Fox News, and Newsmax had all broken into their scheduled programming. The headline running across every screen read, "Kennedy accuses Warren of covering up $4.7 trillion in missing funds." And in living rooms across America, from Oklahoma diners to Bronx bodegas, viewers sat stunned, trying to wrap their minds around a number so large it felt almost fictional. Inside the Capitol complex, Kennedy met with a select group of Republican senators and staffers behind closed doors. He dropped the leather-bound dossier on the mahogany table with a satisfying thud. "This isn't just a case of bad accounting," he said, flipping it open. "This is intentional obfuscation." The dossier was a chilling document. It contained flagged audits from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, unexplained transfers at the Department of Energy, and multiple shadow contracts funneled through obscure shell entities under the guise of strategic contingency expenditures. There were redacted names, missing invoice chains, and one particularly damning email from a Treasury analyst warning of unsustainable off-ledger activity. "This is Enron on steroids," muttered Senator Josh Hawley, staring at the pages, "and they've been getting away with it because no one wanted to touch it," Kennedy said. Until now. Meanwhile, across the Capitol, Elizabeth Warren was in crisis mode. Surrounded by senior aides, lawyers, and longtime allies, she faced the biggest political threat of her career. She hadn't seen it coming, not from Kennedy, not in this way. "Get me the Office of Management and Budget," she barked into her phone. "And tell the press we're preparing a full response." But behind the bravado, Warren knew Kennedy had struck a nerve. The $4.7 trillion figure wasn't plucked from thin air, it matched the exact total of unreconciled obligations that had quietly accumulated across federal agencies since 2001, largely hidden under complex accounting jargon. For years, reformers had whispered about it, but no one dared confront it on the record. No one except Kennedy. As pressure mounted, the White House wasted no time. President Trump called an emergency briefing in the Situation Room. Seated at the table were Attorney General Pam Bondi, Vice President J.D. Vance, and White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. On the screen appeared John Kennedy, patched in remotely from the Capitol. Trump didn't mince words. "John, you just cracked open a hornet's nest. Can you back this up?" "Every word of it," Kennedy responded. "I've got documents, emails, even a former OMB whistleblower willing to testify anonymously for now." Bondi leaned forward. "If this is legit, we may be looking at the largest financial misappropriation in U.S. government history." Trump's face hardened. "Then let's clean house. Start with Warren." Meanwhile, leaks were flying across media outlets. A whistleblower known only as Delta Echo came forward via an encrypted message to independent journalist Glenn Greenwald, confirming that senior officials under previous administrations, including Obama and Biden, had funneled funds into gray ledger projects outside congressional oversight. Social media exploded. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag "Where is the money" began trending at #1 nationwide. The public's outrage was real. Middle-class Americans who'd watched their taxes rise, their wages stagnate, and their trust in Washington erode, finally had a villain with a face and a folksy Louisiana senator swinging the hammer. That evening, Kennedy appeared on Tucker Carlson's new streaming show, which had gained enormous popularity under Trump's second term. "What's going on in D.C., Senator?" Carlson asked. Kennedy grinned. "Well, Tucker, I came up here to drain the swamp, but I didn't know it was bottomless." Laughter. Applause. But then Kennedy grew serious. "This isn't about party. It's about accountability. Somebody has to answer for that missing $4.7 trillion. And I'm not going to stop until we get names." 3 days after Kennedy's explosive Senate confrontation, America braced itself for what would become the most-watched congressional hearings since the Watergate era. Senator Elizabeth Warren, now under immense pressure, had agreed to reopen the Oversight Committee's hearing, this time with full transparency and cameras from every major news outlet. The American people demanded answers, and the world was watching. The hearing chamber was packed. News anchors stood shoulder to shoulder with staffers, Hill reporters, and congressional interns as Senator Kennedy walked in holding an even thicker file, this time bound in red. "Today," he began, adjusting his microphone, "we will hear from someone who has lived inside this mess." From behind a curtain emerged a woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed but clearly anxious. Her name, Lena Hadley, former senior budget analyst at the Office of Management and Budget. A respected bureaucrat with decades of public service, Hadley's credentials were beyond reproach. As she sat down, the room fell silent. Kennedy leaned in. "Ms. Hadley, under oath, can you confirm the existence of gray ledger operations within the federal government, programs that are funded without congressional appropriations and without public disclosure?" Hadley took a deep breath, then nodded. "Yes, Senator. I can." Gasps rippled through the room. These off-ledger programs were authorized through obscure legal interpretations and buried under layers of agency directives. Funds were redirected from surpluses, emergency allocations, and often misreported under vague headings like interdepartmental adjustments or global contingency disbursements. Kennedy pressed further. "And what is the total amount these operations have misappropriated or mismanaged?" Hadley looked down at her notes. According to internal OMB estimates between 2001 and 2023, the figure exceeds $4.7 trillion. This time, even Warren looked shaken. She instinctively looked at her legal advisor, who offered no comfort. "And why?" Kennedy asked. "Was this never brought to Congress?" Hadley hesitated, then gave the answer that sent shockwaves across the nation, because we were told not to. Because multiple administrations, Republican and Democrat, wanted plausible deniability. And because the deeper we looked, the more dangerous it got. Staffers were reassigned, records vanished, and in some cases, people were threatened. A heavy silence took over the room. Then chaos. Senator Warren banged the gavel. This hearing is in recess. But it was too late. Cameras had caught every word. By sundown, Lena Headley's testimony was being replayed on every screen in America. From NBC to Newsmax, from cable to TikTok, the phrase gray ledger programs had entered the national vocabulary. At the White House, President Trump convened with Attorney General Pam Bondi and CIA Director Devin Nunes. "We need arrests," Trump said. "We need indictments. And I want every agency director who signed off on this to come see me tomorrow or clean out their desks." The next morning, FBI raids took place quietly but widely. Several retired officials were taken in for questioning, including 2 former deputy secretaries from the Department of Defense and a senior procurement officer at the Department of Energy. Trump's press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, addressed the nation in a fiery briefing. For too long, Americans were told that their government worked for them. Today, thanks to President Trump and brave leaders like Senator Kennedy, we've learned that wasn't always true. But we are making it true again. This administration will not rest until every dime is accounted for. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Warren's political future hung by a thread. Though she insisted she had never knowingly participated in any illegal activity, public trust was crumbling. Polls showed her approval had dropped by 31 points in 3 days. Liberal media scrambled to do damage control, calling the scandal a systemic failure rather than a partisan one. But the right-wing base wasn't having it. The narrative had crystallized. Kennedy was the whistleblower, Warren was the gatekeeper, and $4.7 trillion had vanished under her watch. In Baton Rouge, Kennedy returned home to a hero's welcome. Supporters cheered, American flags waved, and local radio dubbed it the Louisiana Reckoning. But for Kennedy, the work wasn't done. "This ain't the end," he told a packed town hall. "This is just the beginning. We've poked the beast, and now we're gonna chase it into the light." By the 4th day following Lena Headley's testimony, Washington was in full panic mode. Leaks spread faster than agencies could respond. Internal audits were being torn apart. Several senior officials from previous administrations, including names that once adorned bestsellers and campaign posters, were now subjects of federal inquiries. The term gray ledger programs became the rallying cry for accountability. Congressional offices were flooded with phone calls and emails from citizens demanding justice. Conservative commentators called it the swamp's reckoning, while even traditionally liberal outlets couldn't ignore the bipartisan rot. But in the center of the storm was Senator John Neely Kennedy, now hailed as a national watchdog. Though often known for his quirky, down-home sayings, Kennedy wasn't joking anymore. "This ain't a political stunt," he told Sean Hannity on live TV. "This is about theft. This is about public trust. And it's about time the American people got their money back." The White House was riding the momentum. President Donald Trump, never one to let an opportunity go to waste, delivered an impromptu address from the Rose Garden, flanked by Vice President J.D. Vance and Attorney General Pam Bondi. "My fellow Americans," Trump began, "for decades, corrupt elites in both parties used the government as their own personal ATM. They robbed your tax dollars to fund secret programs, shady contracts, and personal enrichment, and they never thought you'd find out. But you have found out. And under my administration, that era is over." The crowd erupted. In the days that followed, the investigation widened. Independent auditors, now federally empowered under an executive order Trump signed hours after his speech, began tracing paper trails. What they found horrified even the most jaded investigators. Billions had been funneled into defense contracts for weapons that were never built. Trillions more had vanished through complex financial instruments that existed in legal gray zones. NGOs tied to foreign interests had received funding under regional stability grants. Even the Department of Agriculture had inexplicably spent over $600 million on urban resilience drones with no record of what that even meant. Kennedy's dossier, once considered speculative, had cracked the vault, and yet, Senator Elizabeth Warren still refused to resign. She denied wrongdoing, claiming she had been misled by staff and stonewalled by career bureaucrats. "I didn't create these systems," she said during a strained MSNBC interview. "I inherited them. I tried to reform them. And I refused to let John Kennedy turn this into a partisan witch hunt." But the public wasn't buying it. Gallup polls showed trust in Warren plummeting to an all-time low. Across the aisle, even moderate Democrats were backing away from her. Behind the scenes, whispers of a quiet resignation or forced censure grew louder. Then came the final blow. Lena Headley returned to testify in a closed-door session with the Senate Judiciary Committee. This time, she brought recordings, audio files of internal meetings in which Warren's chief of staff discussed burying the ledger discrepancies to avoid public backlash. While Warren herself wasn't directly heard on the tapes, the implication was clear. Her office knew, and they had done nothing. That night, Kennedy delivered a fiery speech from the Senate floor, this time to a chamber that sat in heavy silence. "We are standing at the edge of a constitutional betrayal. Every man and woman in this room swore an oath. Today, I remind you that oath wasn't to a party. It was to the people." He then dropped a motion on the floor, a Senate censure against Elizabeth Warren for dereliction of duty, gross negligence, and obstruction of oversight. Within 24 hours, 63 senators signed on. By morning, Warren's office issued a brief statement. She would not seek re-election and was stepping back from public life to cooperate fully with the investigation. The news exploded. CNN called it the most stunning political fall since Spiro Agnew. Fox News ran with "Kennedy wins. Warren falls. Swamp drained." But Kennedy didn't celebrate. When reporters asked what he thought of Warren stepping down, he replied, "This ain't about talking a scalp. It's about restoring the faith of folks who've been lied to for decades. We've got a long way to go. I just lit the first match." In the days that followed Senator Elizabeth Warren's sudden retreat from public life, the federal government stood at an inflection point. The scale of the scandal had become undeniable, not just one political figure's downfall, but a systemic failure rooted in decades of bipartisan complacency. Senator John Neely Kennedy's probe had lit a fire in Washington that couldn't be contained. With the White House fully engaged, President Donald Trump ordered the creation of a fiscal integrity task force under the Department of Justice, led by Attorney General Pam Bondi. The mandate: find every misappropriated dollar, trace every illegal program, and hold every responsible official accountable regardless of party affiliation. By midweek, the task force had already filed subpoenas for over 400 classified documents spanning 3 administrations. The National Archives confirmed that several financial records had been intentionally misfiled under intelligence classifications, shielding them from congressional oversight for years. One senior National Security Agency contractor was arrested trying to flee the country with encrypted flash drives allegedly containing audit logs and payment authorizations related to the gray ledger accounts. Even the Federal Reserve came under scrutiny. For the first time in modern history, top Fed officials were compelled to testify in a closed-door session before a bipartisan congressional panel. Meanwhile, across America, something unusual was happening: a reawakening of civic engagement. Protests didn't erupt in violence. Instead, citizens gathered peacefully at state capitals holding signs that read, "Where's our $4.7 trillion? Audit everything," and Kennedy was right. Congressional offices, once accustomed to apathy and low voter turnout, found themselves overwhelmed by constituents demanding reform, transparency, and term limits. In Baton Rouge, Kennedy returned to a packed town hall, where people weren't asking for selfies, they were asking what came next. "Senator," an elderly veteran stood up, gripping his cane, "do we get the money back?" Kennedy nodded solemnly. "We're gonna try. Every cent we find, we'll claw back. But this ain't just about money. It's about rebuilding trust, and trust ain't cheap. It takes time, grit, and folks holding their government to account every day, not just during elections." The crowd erupted in applause. That same week, President Trump signed the Federal Transparency and Fiscal Integrity Act, a sweeping piece of legislation co-authored by Kennedy and Senator Josh Hawley. The bill mandated real-time budget tracking accessible to the public, increased penalties for financial misreporting by federal agencies, and created an independent watchdog board composed of civilian auditors and retired judges. One of its most controversial clauses? The criminalization of willful concealment of government expenditures, a felony carrying up to 20 years in prison. It was clear that this wasn't just reform, it was a revolution in how government operated. The media struggled to keep up. Legacy outlets were forced to admit their years of inattention to bureaucratic waste. New platforms emerged, fueled by a public hunger for facts and accountability. Podcasts, investigative YouTube channels, and grassroots watchdog groups flourished, and yet, amid the political wreckage, John Kennedy remained humble. "I didn't plan to be the guy to open this can of worms," he told Tucker Carlson in an exclusive sit-down. "I just read a few too many budget reports that didn't smell right. The people did the rest." Carlson asked, and what about Elizabeth Warren? Kennedy didn't gloat, she'll live with the consequences. But if she helps us clean up the mess now, I won't stop her. America's about redemption too. In a surprising turn, Warren re-emerged weeks later, not with a political defense, but with a formal apology during a televised Senate hearing. She admitted that her office had mishandled information, underestimated the depth of the corruption, and lacked the political courage to confront entrenched systems. I failed the people who trusted me, she said. And I will spend the rest of my life helping to fix what I should have fought harder to expose. The chamber was silent. In an extraordinary show of statesmanship, Kennedy stood up, walked across the floor, and shook her hand. I reckon that's a good place to start, he said. The $4.7 trillion was not recovered in full, but over $600 billion was found within 2 months, frozen in accounts linked to black budget projects, shell corporations, and fraudulent grant programs. Much of it was redirected to veterans' health care, rural infrastructure, and debt relief programs that had long been underfunded. Senator Kennedy's approval rating soared. But more importantly, so did public faith in constitutional oversight. President Trump, energized by the bipartisan success, announced in his next address that this was just the first of many swamps we're gonna drain. What had started as a showdown between Kennedy and Warren had become a defining moment in American history. A political earthquake, a reckoning, and a reminder that in a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, truth, no matter how buried, eventually finds its way to the surface.